Okay, so we're going to get this visual of how to multiply fractions and see if we can see what it means. What's happening? What's really happening to the numbers? Okay, and we're going to do that by looking at some objects and separating them into pieces. Okay, because fractions, remember that fractions are not really numbers. If you have some a over b, what does that literally mean? A divided by b, right? So since fractions are division problems, they don't behave like numbers. Yeah? This is very important. Everybody remember that one, right, guys? All right. Now, if you multiply a number, say 4 times 2, what's 4 times 2 going to give you? 8, right? So what happened? We multiplied two things together, and it made a number that was what? That was
a bigger number.
Bigger. There you go. That's exactly what I wanted. A bigger number than you started with, right? But remember that fractions are not numbers.
Fractions are fractions.
So when we're multiplying with them, we're actually going to be making them, what do you think?
Numbers.
Well, making them smaller.
So you can multiply them again.
Okay, so you've got it. So we need to get a visual of why that's happening and why that's happening to you. Because if you don't understand why it's happening to you, and you don't understand what's going on behind the scenes, then it's going to always cause you trouble. Okay. All right. So let's look at an introduction to multiplication, fractions and fractions. Because what happens when you're multiplying fractions is you're actually breaking them into smaller pieces. Yes?
This doesn't really have any sort of fractions, but for the... Sorry.
Sorry.
Just talking about it. But for the...
All right, so we're going to talk about taking a fraction of a fraction. Because we've taught, guys, come on. We've talked about the word of before, haven't we?
Oh, we don't like all.
Oh.
Does anybody remember what the word of means to do? You bet it does. Of means to multiply, right? So what we're doing is taking a fraction of a fraction, which means that we are actually multiplying them. Fraction of a fraction. Okay? Now, when you think of taking a fraction, you think about that as taking a part. If I told you, for example, I was going to give you half of a cake, are you getting the whole cake?
Nope.
Nope. You're getting a part of it, right? A specific part. Guys. All right. Now, and then if I tell you that you can then have half of her half, are you getting more than she started with? No, you're getting less, right? So a part is going to be a smaller part, right? Does that make sense? And that's what we're going to be looking at in this particular lesson when we're talking about dividing up fractions. They say dividing, but actually we're talking about multiplication, but it's going to cut it into smaller pieces. That's what they mean by dividing. So don't think that means the operation division is dividing. So here we go. We can break up fractions into smaller pieces. So take this cake, for example. Of course, we're going to go with cake. If you have 1/3 of a cake, could you share that 1/3 with someone else?
No.
I didn't say would. I said could. Yes, you could. How could you divide it so that it to be equal if you have 1/3 of it? Just split. You're going to only split it between two people, right? So just split it in half. There you go, right? Divide it by 2. Split it in half. Yeah? Yes.
Can't eat chocolate cake.
Oh, that's true. Well, maybe it's...
No, they can. If it's made with dog chocolate.
They can physically eat it.
Dog
And,
and no.
and since they're drawings of dogs, we're not that worried about them anyway. So okay. All right. Come on. So you can divide it in half, right? And look at what happens. When you divide it in half, you get a smaller fraction of the cake, right? Now, if we divide a third in half, do you think you're going to get a quarter? No. Because we weren't dividing a half in half, we were dividing a third in half. Right? So that's the same as dividing it by 2. So dividing a third in half, think about if it took a whole cake and it was all 3 pieces, right? You divided each one of those pieces into 2 more pieces. We've just doubled the number of pieces we had, right? So instead of 3 pieces of cake, we now have 6 pieces of cake, right? So each one of those pieces would not be one half, but 1/6. Okay? All right. So we're talking about breaking things in half, and we're going to look at how to make that visual representation. Okay? You can divide any fraction into pieces. Any fraction into pieces. All right. So let's look at this example. Guys, focus here. Jeffrey has a packet of ginger slice that is 3/4 full. So does he have the whole packet already? No. He only has how many pieces? 3 out of the, how many pieces were there originally? 4, right? Well, he wants to divide it amongst 3 people. So each one of them gets how many pieces? 1. So 3/4 divided by 3 people would give you what? 1 each, right? 1/4. Each person gets 1/4. Okay? Right? So each person gets 1/4. Make sense? Okay.
Shade in one piece. Do you shade in the white side or the shaded side?
I don't know. You'll have to figure that out in your homework. All right, here we go. So what we were doing when we were breaking those smaller pieces into even smaller pieces is we were finding a fraction of a fraction.
So you find a fraction.
Okay? So that leads us into the idea of being able to multiply. Because think about fractions. When you use fractions in your everyday life, and you do, by the way, every one of you does. Have you ever had a candy bar and somebody says, "Ooh, can I have half?"
No. I have some. I don't get it. Can I eat all myself?
Oh.
People do today.
All right, so let's go. All right? Get it from somebody else if you don't have it. Okay, because that's not really the point. So here we go. So take 8 lollies, for example. All right? So how many do you have? 8. Do you mind sharing? Just pretend you don't mind sharing and say yes.
No.
Then what we're going to do is divide them between these 2 dogs. And so if you divide 8 into 2 groups, you get 2 groups of what? 4. Right? So each dog got how much? As a fraction, half of the candy, right? Okay? So 1/2 of 8 is what? 4. So even though it's of means to multiply, because we're multiplying with a fraction, anytime you're working with fractions, it always indicates you're doing what operation? Fraction bar means to divide. Yes?
This might be a bit early to ask this question, but for the answer...
Ask you a question like this on an assessment, it would say about the dogs, how would you divide it in half? You would say, to divide into 2 groups, I would take half, or you could write it as 1/2, of, how many pieces were there? 8, okay? Which gives what? 4 each. Okay? You need to be able to explain what's happening. That's the kind of questions. And again, we're going to talk about that. Right now we're not there, but we'll talk about that so that you know exactly how to do it. But good a place as any, yeah? So now you kind of know what to expect, right?
Right. I need to write the
Okay.
last couple.
Okay, go ahead. So to divide it into two groups, that means I would take half of the 8, which gives 4 each. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So let's look at... So just as I said, the word of always indicates multiplication. So if you take half of a number, that means you're multiplying. But because it's a fraction, we actually end up dividing it. So the same idea works when you're dividing fractions or taking pieces of fractions. You divided that 1/3 into two equal pieces, right? Okay. So 1/3 divided into 2 pieces is the same as saying half of 1/3. Right? So there's the idea of today's lesson. I told you it's a big, easy lesson today. So the idea is that if you take half of something, that's the same as saying 1/2 what? Times that thing you're taking the part of, right? And does that thing always have to be a whole number? No. Nope. You can take parts of fractions too. So what if I had 1/8? Could I divide 1/8 in half? Yes. I could take half of 1/8. What does 1/2 of 1/8 look like? 1/2. Well, just show me what it would look like in writing out. 1/2 of means what operation? Times 1/8. Okay. Now, if you have an 1/8, it makes it smaller. So, what's going to happen to it? Okay. And we'll talk about that later. We'll talk about how to deal with the multiplication later. Right now, we're just talking about how to set it up. Yeah, 1/16. Okay? All right. So all you're going to be doing in this exercise is simply rewriting division as multiplication. So if I take 1/3 and divide it into 2 equal pieces, that's the same as taking half of what? 1/3. Okay? Can you handle that?
No.
So what fraction is 2/3 of half a dozen? 2/3 means 2 over what? 3. Of means times. Half a dozen is 1/2, right? Don't worry about the half a dozen. It's just 1/2 of, or half a dozen, half of what of a dozen. So 1/2. Okay? So 2/3 of 1/2. Yes, ma'am. Just getting a visual idea of how to break things into pieces. This is not the way you're going to do the math. But it's just giving you a visual idea because some of you are very visual learners, some of you aren't. Okay? So some of you, this kind of thing makes more sense than others. Some of you like to just do the algorithms, the method, the process. Right? So you're going to see it both ways. So we can hit everybody. All right? Okay. Dividing something into pieces is the same as, what do you think? Multiplying by a what? Fraction. There you go. Right? Good deal. Dividing a fraction by 3 is the same as multiplying by what? Dividing by 3 is the same as multiplying by 1/3. There you go. So, right? Remember, divide by 3 is the same as multiply by 1/3. Okay? All right. Which of the following are equal to 1/4 of 1/2? So 1/4 of 1/2. Sure, go ahead.
The first one?
So the first one, 1/4 divided by 1/2. The numbers are in the right order, but what's wrong?
It's times.
Yes, be careful. What does of mean?
Times.
Yes. So that number right there means half. So 1/4, 1/2. You had the numbers right, but not divide, but multiply. Oops, sorry. We all use an X. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay? All right? So, how much more time do we have? 5 minutes. I'm trying to kill it. Rewrite this division as a problem using fractions. So instead of 3/5 divided by 2, what would you change it to? 3/5 what? Times what, though? Times 2? Times 1/2. Divide by 2 is the same as multiply by 1/2. Okay? So which one? 1, 2, 3, or 4? You got it written right there. Which one looks like the one I wrote? Is that one? No, because that's division. So, is that one? Nope, that's division. That one. Because they wrote it in a different order, but does the order when you multiply matter? No. There you go. Okay. Let's see what it says. These are questions you're going to have to be able to do.
Thanks for giving us the answers.
We're working the homework together. Because we're good.
Finish it together. Will you take it off
Why the drivers of maths?
To use your brain. I'm just trying to help you see what you're doing. Okay. So let's look at these. You're going to drag and drop them. So 2/3 divided by 5 is the same as 2/3 times what? Divide by 5 is the same as multiply by what? 7. What? What? Are you crazy? Have you just lost interest? Okay. So it's this one. Yep. Okay, because the order doesn't make a difference. Okay. All right.